Hi, this is Maria, and I'm doing another episode of Maria Unfiltered, and the video series is Forgiveness to Love, and it's my life exposed here. And so, in today's video, I want to share with you a story of two little lovebirds. At the time when my father wanted to ask my mother to marry him, he was a poor OBGYN resident who had just arrived from Athens via Montreal, and he had no money, and certainly no money for a ring. So he borrowed money from my grandfather and promised my mom that one day he would buy her a much more special ring and that it would be worth the wait. Well, 2 decades later, my father surprised my mother with a 5-some-carat flawless estate diamond. It was absolutely gorgeous, and my mother was so surprised that she could hardly believe his thoughtfulness, and they both celebrated with tears in their eyes. It was the cutest scene you could imagine. At least it was the cutest scene I could have ever imagined between my parents. Anyway, my mom truly cherished this most special gift. And due to its value, she had to call her insurance agent on Fridays from the bank where she removed the rock from the safety deposit box. And then she would then wear the ring during the weekend and then return it on Monday. And then call the insurance agent and say, well, it's back safe. It's in the bank box. Well, in 2010, my dad told me that he decided it was time my mother's $1 million plus jewels were divided between his two daughters, and that he would do this on Christmas Eve. And he was going to be in charge of the flip. And he wanted to make sure that I had a bank box and a vault of my own. And so in terms of the flip, the winner would get the ring, and then the loser would get an equal amount in value of other diamonds. So whether it was necklaces or bracelets or other rings or whatever, anyway, or earrings even. And so, and that was going to happen on Christmas Eve. So that was pretty exciting. And so, sadly, though, his well-intentioned and generous offerings may have very well cost him his life. He died just 4 short months before that Christmas, and the jewels were never divided. I got nothing, while my sibling got everything. And that was just one example of many painful learning experiences that I have had over the last few years. During the time that my mother was being starved, my sibling walked into my mother's room wearing this huge diamond and other jewels of my mother's. And then, as I was right next to my mom, who was laying in bed, and then the sibling repeatedly waved her hand in dramatic gyrations, flashing the glistening gem in front of my sweet mother's tortured face. So, yes, the scene was as horrifying as it was gruesome. And my lovely mother, despite being in her dehydrated and devastated state, was aghast. And her tender eyes were following this gem, this sparkling gem, all around on this hand that was making all these exaggerated movements. And my frail mom began to cry, but she could only produce one single tear. And that tear slowly dripped down my mother's hollow cheek. And in that moment, I knew that my mother knew that she was being sacrificed for money, for jewelry. And my mother cleverly batted her eyelashes. And in the richness of her expression, she wanted me to know that she knew. And it's interesting that my father, too, died a mysterious death in August of 2010, just 9 months before my mother. At one time, my father's disappearance and death were beyond explanation or comprehension. Yet after witnessing the boundless greed and the depravity surrounding my mother's death, the puzzle pieces slowly began coming together. And may I add that as I shared that my mom, my Uncle George, and I love doing jigsaw puzzles together on holidays, perhaps that too was prophetic, because I realized that my dad mysteriously died on the same day, August 27th, as my Nana. And my Nana was my grandfather's sister, who was my favorite, and would leave her friends every night and come to the home where I lived with my grandparents and my parents. And she had these beautiful long fingernails, and she would sit on my bed and she would scratch my back and she would sing me songs and she would tell me stories. And that's how I fell asleep every night. And so my Nana was like my favorite too. It was my Nana and I was her favorite. And my Uncle George was my favorite and I was his favorite. And so the three of us were always so close. But my Nana mysteriously died on the same day during my divorce. Years after her brother George, my grandfather, died. And then my father died on that same day in 2010, on August 27th. And so all three deaths all on the same day, that just didn't make sense to me. And those were three people that I loved so very, very much, and who so very, very much loved their Maria. And my Uncle George, it was determined that actually he was a victim of, well, I'd like to say unmitigated vengeance, but I have to say that he was the victim of a iatrogenic error, which just means that it was a doctor error, because the doctor, he had just seen the doctor, and the doctor made a mistake in changing his heart medication. And so his levels of electrolytes were off, and he died. And so, additionally, as I mentioned that my mother died on May 21st, May 21st just happened to be the day that my third son, Stephen, was born. So I was so confused. When do criminals draw the line? Is there a line to be drawn? Or is it only when darkness fades and the sun appears? Truly, for some of the lower vibrating beings on this planet, people are expendable, especially when they're dearly loved by me. That's what it feels like to me. You know, in an instant, once perplexing situations were beginning to become crystal clear. And at some point, the light shined and some people banked. Interesting word choice, isn't it? on hiding in the dark like the cockroaches, for many crimes were to be exposed. And I do believe that, with the eclipse and with all the things going on planetarily, I really do believe that so many things are bubbling up to the surface, and that um, much, much of the darkness that has been hidden is now being exposed. And thank God. Yes, thank you, God. Um, because there has been so much subterfuge, and there has been so many machinations that have been going on behind the scenes that people were just never aware of. And even if they suspected it, they had no proof. And so now things really are, people are finding out, and and so it's being exposed. So when I was telling you about my father who disappeared, on this sunny, warm day in July in 2010, and he seemed to have vanished into thin air. I don't think I explained that very well, but his condo was just down the hall from mine, because when I decided to move there in 2004, there happened to be a condo right on his floor. And so he said, "Maria, there's a condo right here on this floor. Do you want me to buy it for you?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, Daddy, that sounds like a great idea." And so he bought it, and he was happy too, because in his trust, or in his will, he had one condo there. And along with his other assets that were to be divided between my sister and me, he said, "Well, one of you is going to have to buy the other one out, and chances are you'll buy her out because she already has a home here in Florida, in Bel Air, with her husband. And so you will probably buy her out because she doesn't need a condo on the beach." And so this way, when he bought the second condo, he said, "This works out great. I have two daughters. Now I have two condos. So you will live in this one. You can have this one right now as soon as we buy it, and you can begin living there. And then she'll get the condo that your mother and I are living in when we pass." And so that seemed, to be the perfect solution. But so we lived down the hall from each other, and every day I would swing by, I'd stop by his condo to see how he's doing. And usually I'd catch him around breakfast time, but sometimes for lunch. And, and so on this particular day, I came into the condo. I went in, and he was nowhere to be found, but his cereal bowl was on the kitchen table, and as was his mail. But his car was still in the parking lot. And so I thought, that's really weird. And so I began to become concerned. And I started calling neighbors and friends and some relatives, and no one seemed to know anything about his whereabouts. And at one point I thought, oh, well, maybe he just decided to go to Greece. Maybe he decided on a little European jaunt. But usually, he would give me his flight information and tell me about his trip, and he was planning it well in advance. And so this just seemed to be a little weird. And so the one thing that was consistent in the message with all the people that I had approached, that I had called, was they said, "Oh, don't worry about it because he couldn't have gone too far." And I thought, how strange, you know. Um, that was just very weird, I thought. Anyway, um, so there was just something that seemed a bit sinister about the whole thing. And so I called the Clearwater Police and the Sheriff's Department and the other law enforcement things, and I told them what was going on, and I wanted them to document it, and I wanted a missing persons report. And they said, because he was definitely missing, right? And they said, "Oh, well, we have to wait 30 days for that," or something like that. Anyway, I felt like I was kind of getting the runaround because I didn't feel like it was being appropriately documented, right? I thought, well, why don't you send like a silver alert or something? I mean, he's missing, right? And so whether he's walked out of the condo or where he is or went someplace with someone, he's not answering his cell phone. No one has seen him. come in or out of the building today. So that was just weird. But on August 27th, the day that, my grandfather and my nana died, I was at Morton Plant Gym, which was the local hospital, and they had a big, beautiful gym facility there. And a woman who seemed quite friendly with my father was there. And she said to me that my father was with his daughter. And I thought, it was very weird. So when I arrived back at my condo, there was a message from my sibling with a room number telling me that our father had taken a turn for the worst and he was in the hospital, and if I wanted to see him, I'd better hurry up. So I went running, and of course, and she left his room number. Well, I went running, and of course, the room number didn't exist. But somehow I found the room, and upon entering, my sibling began screaming, and it deteriorated into some show, like a horror show, where she was saying I don't pay enough attention to her, and I think I'm better than she is, and that I ignore her. And I didn't know what to think, actually. And so I went and I stood on the side of my father's bed, and she stood on the other side of him. And she kind of kept grabbing his face, saying, look at me. I'm the one who loves you. And I thought, well, this isn't really helping our dad. And so I went and sat in the corner. And actually, I was wondering if this was being filmed for some like really weird horror show or candid camera or or something very strange. But I went and I sat in the far corner. And then I noticed that my father's breathing was becoming very labored. And so I got up and I stood stood by the side of his bed, and I put one hand on his heart and one hand on his arm. And I told him I loved him. And after he calmed down a bit, he took his last breath and away he went. And my sibling then began calling neighbors and relatives and friends. And what struck me was that they all knew of his situation and his whereabouts. Yet I wondered why so many people chose to lie to me. And so ultimately, what seemed to be coincidences, both in the timing of both my parents' deaths and the masks that different people wore when they said they had no idea about where he was, they began to crumble. And I started to see the true colors of people. And even at a few days later, I actually went to the funeral home to ask to see my dad. And I was told that no, my sibling would not allow me to get any information about my father. And I was just so horrified as to why I was so shunned. And let's see. So I've since learned, and I've been told, that it's more than likely that my father was drugged or poisoned and then admitted to the hospital 6 weeks prior. And I still didn't understand why no one told me about this. And I reached out to everyone I could think of to help me. And so I just wanted help from my father. But, and I didn't understand why the police couldn't do their own check for the hospital, even though I was told that there was no record of admission. But I realized that human beings, are cruel, and human beings are asleep. Many human beings are. and they're asleep to who they are. And human beings are unconscious. And so, but you and I don't have to live that way. You know, you are here to change lives. You are here to shine. You are here to rise above the darkness and the injustice. And I reached out everywhere. And even the Clearwater Greek Church shrugged when I called to see if anyone knew of my father's whereabouts. And shortly thereafter, I saw the Greek priest, and he was driving a car that looked just like my dad's. Now, yeah, I'm not here to judge, and yet I choose truth. And for far too long, there have been many backroom dealings and secrets and lies, and this is the time when the darkness is being exposed. For hidden agendas have sadly overtaken our world. And when human beings act in integrity, there's nothing to hide. You know, truly. Transparency is truly the key to freedom. So once my dad was admitted into the hospital, he was never going to get out of there alive. And my sibling was helping herself to my parents' fortune. And with the deaths of each of my parents, the funeral was supposedly private. Yet there were hundreds in attendance. So apparently it was private only as it related to me. And the obituary, I couldn't find the obituary until after the burial. So I had no info on the time or the location of the sacrament. And I actually had to hire an attorney to ensure that my sibling wouldn't have me arrested for attending either of my parents' funerals. Just like she had threatened to have me arrested if I had stayed with my mother at the nursing home. So each night before the service, I went to the funeral homes and I wasn't allowed to see them. And then upon my arrival at the church in the morning, the funeral directors were big, burly, bouncy guys, and they refused to let me in the church. And they actually blocked the door and told me that not only was I not allowed to be alone in the church with my parent, but that I must wait outside until my sibling arrived and was the first to enter the church. And then in the church, the priest gave, lovely eulogies, spoke of my mom and dad, having one daughter, and then both times handed her the cross that had been in each of the caskets. And so while I was about to exit the church during my mother's funeral, I happened to notice someone who admitted to working with the ex and the sibling to destroy me and was kind of huddled around my relatives. And so apparently he had been invited, but I wasn't. And he was actually the one that on Martin Luther King's Day, he assaulted and battered my significant other in the parking garage of our building as we were about to get into our car. But after the drama of that attack and arrest, I was so afraid. And I filed for 3 different OPs, orders of protection. But it appeared his attorneys had negotiated some deal. And so, and then he was arrested. But then the state's attorney's case against him for lunging at me and bludgeoning my friend was not going to give him more than a slap on his hand. But, of course I wanted justice, but I also wanted peace, and the nonsense of keeping me from my own parents' funerals was so absolutely cruel and crazy. But I did decide to attend my beautiful mom's funeral from afar. And so I just stayed in my car. I didn't get out. And as it was, my mother hardly weighed 50 pounds in her starved state, so the casket was closed. Yet both of my parents are forever in my heart, for sure. But as it turned out, and you won't even believe this, once I arrived at the cemetery, I realized that the tented burial site, with chairs and flowers and it was just inside the entrance. So you entered, and right there on the right, it was just to the side of the entrance, was staged. And it was to actually hide the location of my parents' actual graves from me. And so I thought, wow, human beings can be very ugly. And that's their choice. But you can choose better. And I can choose better. Ugliness has truly been a contagion that has festered in the minds of the unconscious. For only darkness rejoices in hurting others, right? Because God is love. And the Christ symbolizes the greatest love of all. Absolutely. And so there is never, ever a justification for cruelty, for lies, for manipulation, for destruction, or for creating pain in the lives of any living creature, much less a human being, or a brother, or a sister, or a parent, who is in fact a reflection of you. To think otherwise is sheer insanity, and only the most primitive among us can dwell in a cesspool of their own making. What I observed at the cemetery was really a most ridiculous and macabre display of ego. And as for me, I found this to be an important test of my own spiritual understanding. Because from a higher perspective, I knew that neither the soul of my mother or of my father was in that body, in that casket. And in case the plan was for me to lose it, given that amount of cruelty, just wasn't going to happen. And so I simply called upon my inner knowing that I was to release my parents in the flesh. Because my parents' essence, my parents' soul, is eternal. As is everyone you have ever known who has transitioned, who is no longer on the earth plane. Their soul is eternal. And they are occupying some other dimension. And so their soul, my mother and my father, neither were to be found in the ground. And both spirits had transcended this dimension. I absolutely believe that. And so clearly we see the sadism and the utter disrespect for human life. And these are precisely, the energy of the unconscious on planet Earth that are being purged from the planet right now. Because God has shown us that in fact this must be so. Because we are here to rise above the third dimension. And so remember, there are many lost souls on the earth plane. And for eons, they have been lowering the vibration of our planet and that of the collective consciousness. So let's explore what happens when that energy, when it returns, to those who inflict misery onto others. And so stand strong. Know who you are to create a life of joy and a life of kindness and gentleness and love and smiles and laughter and even giggles, if you will. So thank you for being here with me. And now we're going to go on to number 4, to part 4, where seeing things with eyes wide open and an opened heart changes everything. And that I promise you. And so until then, just remember how very, very much I love you and I honor you. And so I wish you a beautiful rest of your day. And I'll see you soon.